It's also an issue here of scale. I mean, so California says we are going to try to deal with climate changing gases, and we're going to really clamp down on all of the factories in our state that are emitting these things. Well, that might be fine, but you know, the company says, all right, we'll close this factory and we'll move to Arizona. Or maybe they're going to stay in California, but then they lose out competitively in business to somebody who's in Arizona that doesn't have the same limits. You get the idea. An awful lot of our problems, I think, can only be dealt with through collective action, and I could give you lots more examples of them. So what is the problem? Why do we have trouble making these collective decisions? Well, that's a huge topic. It would touch upon lots of political ideology considerations, lots of cultural values. You know, it would get to the root of our inherent liberalism in the old sense, our sort of ardent individualism, or maybe it's a selfishness, you could describe it that way. It's our faith in the market or faith in technology, you know, the belief that, oh well, the market will take care of our problems and we don't need to work together in any other way to do it. Or some technological solution will come along to deal with the problem and we therefore don't need to work together in any other way. I want to talk though for a few minutes about land use issues. Some of the illustrations I've given you already are land use issues. But I want to elaborate upon them a little bit. I'm guessing most of you, maybe all of you, have heard this old story about the tragedy of the commons that was made popular by the Garrett Hardin some years ago. I mean, he wasn't the first one to come up with the notion, of course. He was saying the same thing for literally thousands of years. But he gave it sort of a catchy name. And the idea of the tragedy of the commons, of course, the example that he used that people remember, he actually gave two examples, but the one that people remember has to do with the open pasture or grazing commons. The various livestock owners have an incentive to put more and more animals on the commons because their animals, to the extent they eat the forage, the economic benefit will come to them. Unfortunately, as people put too many animals on this commons, overgrazing leads to degradation. There's an overall decline, and yet each individual has an incentive to keep putting on more. So the commons as a whole declines, productivity goes down, and this is a tragedy of sorts. It's a nice story, and there's some examples of it happening. I sort of wish that he hadn't used the term tragedy of the commons because it sort of blames the commons. Of course, there's nothing wrong with the grassland. The problem, again, is human behavior. It's the way people are using it. And what you could say is, well, the problem is that people are rushing out there and only looking after themselves. I mean, it's the attitude that drives their behavior that is the problem. So maybe we should have called it the tragedy of selfish individualism. That would be a vastly more accurate point. Another way to talk about it, though, is that, frankly, it was a problem of a failure of the people to get together and to make a collective plan. So it was the failure of collective action. It might be the tragedy of individualism or something like that. Anyway, setting that to one side, a lot of times people will say, oh, gee, that's our environmental problem. Writ large, we have all of these commons and people are rushing in and using them. There's certainly some truth to that, but I think it can be very confusing. And I would say, particularly with respect to land use issues in our country today, our major problem is a tragedy of a much different type. It's a tragedy that I would refer to as the tragedy of fragmentation, meaning basically that we have taken our natural communities, our landscapes, and divided them into lots of pieces and turned control over those pieces to owners or managers. Maybe it's a private property parcel, maybe it's a political jurisdiction. We have given them so much independent control over these pieces that we really have no ability now to coordinate resource and land uses at larger spatial scales. If you can sort of imagine an early time when people, before government, before any private property, when people are just collectively using a land, they then, by stages, move to a situation where they have allocated pieces of the land to individual owners or to groups. maybe you call them private entities, maybe they're public or governmental entities, it makes no difference. But we've then given them authority over all the pieces, and they are now using the pieces in ways that are dragging the whole landscape down, and we just don't have a power at a higher level to engage in the kind of collective action that I'm talking about, the kind of collection action that I think is needed for us. There are an awful lot of forces in our society, of course, that promote fragmentation, that is dividing us, keeping us apart, getting us acting individually in our own self-interest. You know, the market itself, free market, is a very powerful force of fragmentation. In fact, it works by fragmenting. You know, it deals with people individually as consumers and producers, and famously commodifies nature. It separates, a point that is made by some writers today, it tends to separate products from their history, so when you go to a store and you buy something, you typically have no idea where it came from, or the circumstances under which it was made, or who made it, and what the cost to those people was, and so on. Just like when the garbage truck comes, it takes your waste away, and you have no idea where it goes. You throw your stuff into recycling bins thinking that they're actually going to be recycled. The little dirty secret is there's a good chance that they're not going to be recycled. They're just thrown into a landfill somewhere, but you don't like to talk about that. A lot of it though, I don't mean just to label the market, because frankly I think the market and our attitudes toward the market are just sort of pretty much embodiments of our cultural attitudes generally. We've got a strong dislike of government. To varying degrees, people view it as an alien force. Politically, a lot of people say, oh, we want the least government possible. Well, delete the word government and put in collective action, meaning we want to do as few things collectively as possible. And that's part and parcel of the problem I'm getting at here. The less government we have, the less collective action we have. I don't mean it has to be through contemporary political channels. I wish I had time to talk about that issue, but the less we work together, the more fragmented we will be, and the more difficult, impossible really, it will be for us to deal with lots of our environmental problems. We talked here some about Christianity. I think as a religion, Christianity tends to be very fragmenting, more so in some forms than others. It does tend to have a focus in many forms on individual salvation. Your fate as a person is going to be determined by what you do individually. It's not going to be tied to the fate of a community as such. We talk about individual conversion experiences. Very much a fragmented view of the world. I'm no expert on Islam, for instance, but a major element of Islamic thought, of Muslim thought, is what they call the ummah, the community, larger community, and the fate of the individual is vastly more dependent upon the fate of the community. Of course, there have been forms of Christianity that have been much more communitarian. Some of you may know that the early Puritans who came to Massachusetts had a stronger sense of being part of a covenanted community, where the welfare of the individual was dependent upon the welfare of the community as such, which is, of course, one reason why they got such a bad reputation for watching what their neighbors were doing and showing concern. But it wasn't just nosiness. There was a strong sense that what their neighbors were doing affected them, and which is why they wanted people to live in close proximity, and why, by the way, they put in some land use rules that we would find completely intolerable. There is, by the way, a very long history of communal land use regulation. It's not something that came in the 20th century. Well, it just seems to me that these days, in much of Christianity, the fate of each person is determined in isolation. And that's a huge problem, because it isn't the case when you talk about our embeddedness in nature. Libertarian political philosophy, we could talk about that. Something about this strand of it known as contractarianism, that you really shouldn't have any obligations imposed on you unless you have intentionally and individually agreed to them.